Ever since Mario Kart Wii, Coconut Mall has remained one of Mario Kart's most iconic and beloved tracks. From its exhilarating music to the dozens of lively glowing storefronts, this track has so much character. But those of us who raced through it back on the Wii remember something much more expansive and beautiful than what we actually raced through. What I mean by that is, this crap is friggin' disgusting. Turns out graphics have changed quite a lot in the last 35 years, or however long ago this came out. So now I gotta get that awful feeling when I look back at this track. Like, where's the real Coconut Mall? The one that doesn't look like expired oatmeal. I could have sworn this track looked better than this. But with Mario Kart 8's Booster Course Pass, this was about to change. A new version of Coconut Mall would be created and further reinforce the feeling that the real Coconut Mall was still missing. Seriously, what is this? I don't want to undermine the work that went into it. I do think that it looks great. But is it Coconut Mall? The orangey color scheme, the lack of textures, the replacement of the escalators, the prototype-looking floor pattern, and my goodness, the storefronts. They're pretty much all completely empty. Sure, the original stores looked a little interesting, but that's what made them so great. They were interesting. They were something to look at, something to ponder, something somebody spent time making. I won't stand for it. A fictional shopping mall is in peril? Not on my watch. It may not be easy, and it may not be worth it, but here's how it happened. Here's how I fixed Coconut Mall. Debatably. Earlier this year, I took on a similar project, updating Toad's factory. It ended up looking pretty good, and thanks to Chirpy Luna, it's working great in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. I'll have the link in the description to Chirpy Luna's video, where you can find the mod download. But anyways, this project ended up being quite a bit more difficult than even Toad's factory. You wouldn't think it since I've got a new model to work with. I won't have to put up with nacho-like geometry, or reinvent the piston. But I do have to detail an entire shopping mall, and making a Coconut Mall that lives up to my nostalgia was not easy. But it was seriously fun. This project was absolutely packed with my favorite kinds of 3D modeling work, giving different rooms their own personality and filling them all with fun little details, and the occasional everything blowing up and turning evil. We'll get to that later. Let's start where all good things begin, the model's resource. I went ahead and downloaded the BCP track model and scoped the scene. The first phase of this project is going to be texture updates. I do have names for areas of this track to make things easier, but this update won't be like the sectioned out project that Toad's factory was. Instead, I'll be updating the whole building in several phases, starting with basic texture updates. I kept analyzing this new track model, trying to figure out what all needs updating before I start. I also explored the original track to understand what this has that the BCP version is missing. Well, for starters, I think that whoever got rid of the classic floor tiles should sit in the corner until they're ready to apologize. These floor tiles are a definite part of this track's identity. So I found the original Mario Kart Wii floor tile texture. This is what we'll be recreating. I can't tell if that's detail or JPEG compression. Whatever it is, I like it. Sadly, however, I've got to make a new version of this that looks a little less microwaved. So I scaled it up in Photoshop and began haphazardly throwing squares next to one another. In case you couldn't tell, I'm not a professional. I haven't taken any classes or anything on 3D modeling or digital arts, so I really only know the things I've had to use, which I guess is a good thing. Checkmate college. I made a squares floor and I didn't even need any help. So now that this floor tile material is done, I'm gonna want to make a couple more textures out of this to make it look extra nice. The first is a specular map. A specular map is a black and white image that makes different parts of your texture more or less reflective. I don't use these on every one of my textures since some materials are fine to just have one uniform level of shininess. Or at least that's what I tell myself when I'm too lazy to make a specular map. But for this floor texture, I want it to have a sort of splotchy reflectiveness, like it's been mopped over and has that slightly uneven cloudy look. So I did my best to make my own specular map by generating black and white clouds in Photoshop. This ended up not looking great, and I would eventually replace this specular map with one that I found in a different Mario Kart track. But for now, I'll move on to making the normal map. A normal map is similar to a specular map, but instead of just changing the roughness of an area, it actually changes the apparent height of that area, giving flat faces some nice texture that'll interact with the lights in your scene. And the great thing is, this map doesn't actually affect the geometry, so you can keep the polygon count low while having tiny details on a surface. Checkmate, atheists. To generate a normal map in Photoshop, you've just got to select your image, and up here under Filters 3D, you'll find Generate Normal Map. Then it'll tell you that you can't. Well, great. I spent a little while updating drivers, messing with Photoshop settings, updating Photoshop, but what ended up fixing it was to un-update Photoshop. Adobe, so innovative that you have to un-update their software to fix issues. Anyways, after rolling back to version 25, the normal map is generating like normal. like usual, like it should. Now we've got everything we need to give Coconut Mall its proper floor. First, I've just got to select it. The whole thing. This is when I realized that selecting specific geometry in a project that has like a million polygons and materials is actually pretty tricky. I tried using the L key to select linked geometry, which is usually extremely helpful. But here, the floor is made out of a bunch of separated squares, so that makes things kind of annoying. I also tried selecting by the material, but there was a bunch of other stuff that used the same texture that I didn't want to mess with yet. I figured that if there was a way to see unselected geometry laid out on the UV editor and select it from there, then I could just select the geometry that uses this part of the texture. And after looking around online a little bit, well, turns out there's a button that does that thing that I just said. If you press this button up here with the arrows, it syncs the UV selection with the object selection, meaning I can select something on the UV map and it'll select it on the viewport. Initially, it looked like this because I was looking at all 200-something thousand polygons. But after separating the material by selecting it, pressing P, and choosing selection, I've got the material isolated. Now I can just select the geometry that uses this awful floor pattern and separate it off. Then I can put it in texture jail for its crimes. Now I can create a new material that uses my floor tile texture. And it's horrible. Turns out the way that the floor was unwrapped worked for that old texture, but not my new one. So I had to re-unwrap it in a way that works. The easiest way to do so for a simple tiling texture like this being projected onto a flat plane is to bring the camera directly overhead and press U, then select Project from View. This basically throws the texture straight onto what you're looking at instead of doing anything fancy, which worked perfectly for this floor. But if you're trying to use this on, say, a cube, you'll end up with one of those perspective art pieces that only looks good from one angle. Now I can just scale the UV map up on the left, which effectively scales the texture down on the geometry. Alright, this is looking pretty good. Now I've just got to hook up the specular and normal maps. For the specular map, you can either drag the image in from your folder, or you can make another image texture node and select the file path. Now you just drag it off onto the roughness and watch it not work. That's because my specular map sucks, and I had to use a mix node to get it looking right, and I just ended up replacing it later anyways. This is where that whole college thing would have come in handy. The normal map setup is similar to the specular map, but you've got to run it through a normal map node and make sure the color space is set to non-color. And there we go, a nice looking floor material. Would you be upset if I told you I need well over 100 materials? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I won't be going into painful detail on every single material, just the ones that have an interesting process. Most of them I just stole from other Mario Kart tracks, and a lot of them were overlooked and updated at random points after the main texturing phase of the project. It was too easy to miss things going through such a large and intricate model, but something I wanted to get done right away was the glass material. I figured this would be something very easy to set up and look nice. That's right, I'm already out of steam and going for the easy stuff. Here's how you get a glass material working in the Eevee render engine. Make sure you have refraction checked under screen space reflections up here in this tab. Then set the transmission on your material to 1, and set the blend mode to alpha blend. Now this didn't work for me at first, which was really confusing, but that was because everything else was also set to alpha blend, so I had to go down the list and set them all to opaque one by one. If you know how to change them all at once, please tell me. This sucks. After that, you can turn on ray trace refraction, which I don't know what it is, but it needs to be on for mine to work for some reason. You can also mess with IQR and roughness and whatnot to get a different look. And there you go, that looks pretty cool. This is usually the point that I realize, oh wow, I just spent several hours making a floor and glass, and now I have to make everything else. But I was determined to give this building the makeover it deserves. I was willing to push through those first few boring steps to get to the real good stuff. I decided not to do intricate wall materials right now, and to instead just edit the color palette to achieve a new color scheme. This way I can achieve the right look quicker and work on materials from there. My main wall texture is going to look a lot better if it's already surrounded by the right colors. So I opened the color palette in Photoshop and colored over some of the spots with blue and white tones from the original Coconut Mall. The way color palettes work is the same as any other texture. You have an image that you unwrap geometry onto in order to dictate how that texture fits over the object. But with the color palette, you aren't doing any finicky unwrapping to display a texture. You just need the geometry unwrapped somewhere within the color on the palette. But mainly, by using color palettes, you save tremendously on file size. I mean seriously, these things are usually about 200 bytes. But you do end up costing yourself polygons, since patterns need to be defined by geometry if they aren't defined by the texture. So why in the world would this track be made mostly out of color palettes? Well, it's because Nintendo hates us and thinks we all want to play Play-Doh, Crayola, Duplo versions of these tracks. Well, it's actually because this track was designed for Mario Kart Tour, a mobile game for people who like Play-Doh, Crayola, Duplo tracks. I'm just kidding, I'm sorry. So in theory, the idea behind using color palettes in Tour is you make the polygon count higher in order to shrink the file size. Most phones can run this track just fine with the extra polygons, but ain't nobody gonna download a mobile game that's 20 gigabytes. That's why we don't have nice, high-resolution textures and fun normal maps here. They would make Mario Kart Tour into an unreasonably large download. Applying actual textures to these surfaces is a key part of making this into more than just a mobile game reimagining of Coconut Mall. So I got back to texturing, starting with the pillars. In the original track, these pillars are made of alternating pink and orange bricks, so I'll try and set up something similar. Creating the texture was simple enough. I just made some squares, generated some noise, and used an oil painting filter to get a rough concrete look. But the real issue came when I went to apply the texture to these pillars. Cause see, these pillars are actually a pile of triangles, and unwrapping a flat image of alternating cubes onto a cubic cylindrical pillar of triangles is a job for somebody with thicker glasses than me. But alas, I did figure it out. I ended up using something called this sucks. Manually unwrapping this geometry, and it worked. It looks alright. On this pillar, there's a few more. But luckily, I can just duplicate this unwrapped pillar and replace all of the old ones. Now that we've updated the very pillars that hold this place together, I'll take on something a little more important, the flowers. Instead of these two hideous flower boxes next to the escalator, I want to bring back the original look of the long flower beds on either side of the railing. So I separated and stretched the flower box and put a grass material in it. This grass material is something I took from another Mario Kart track, which is luckily how I'll be getting a lot of these textures. It's also how I got the flowers that I'm gonna put in this flower bed. I downloaded the model of Super Bell Subway and separated some of these flowers, which look way better than the BCP flowers. I like this. Let's update the handrail next since we've already done so much around them. For the actual railing, I decided to use a wood texture from the Animal Crossing track. And for the posts, I created a steel material by selecting a grayish color and making the metallic high and the roughness low. Well, that's pretty cool. This area is starting to come together. After adding a few lights to see how the lighting will add to this scene, I'm starting to feel very good about this. Then I looked around the track at everything else I need to update and started feeling pretty overwhelmed. But the Toad's Factory revamp was very overwhelming too, and that ended up turning out pretty good. What? Why are you laughing? So I ignored the staggering quantity of work that lie ahead and stared at the ceiling, because that's what we're updating next. The texture was pretty much the same process as the pillars. Use the oil painting filter on noise to get a nice effect. And with the normal map applied, this looks shockingly good for some image that was completely fabricated in Photoshop using a couple filters. The next thing I did was bring those banners back that sit on the pillars. I opened the new sign texture that this BCP version of Coconut Mall uses. I needed to make green and pink versions of these blue and red banners, so I duplicated them and put color overlays on them. Then I put those banners onto cylinders with the steel texture, and we've got some cool banners that I think bring back some of the character of the original track. And after messing with the flower basket a bit, I set up the camera to create a render to share my progress in a community post. Oh, and if you're ever having trouble lining your camera up, try using Ctrl-Alt-0 and the camera will snap to your current view. This room isn't done. We've got all kinds of work waiting in each of these storefronts, but what's important is that we've got that Coconut Mall look back. The next thing I did was go ahead and update the handrails in the main room and by the food court, since I've got the materials ready for those anyways. Then, after updating the pillars in the main room, I started working on the rocks and palm trees. I started with the rocks, and after setting up the normal map, these are looking good. I also deleted these little grass triangles. Sorry, grass triangles. Then I gave the palm trees some bark, which looks better, aside from this seam in the unwrapping. But don't worry. It's not that bad. These transparent palm leaf textures luckily worked great on this leaf geometry. Then, sticking to this relative area, I started updating the fountain. I don't plan on having water shoot out of this because I don't know how to do that, but I'd like for it to at least look good. After the fountain, I went around the main room and worked on some things like flower baskets and wall materials. Then I used a wood plank texture here. The main room is starting to come together, but there's something I should fix real quick. I am trying to make this track look more realistic, but this 360 HDR image is a bit much. I needed an actual skybox, so I got one from Hyrule Circuit and set the shadow mode to none. That way the sun can shine through it. Now that I fixed the sky, I should go ahead and fix the escalators. I'm somehow just realizing how unorganized this whole project was. Anyways, I was in luck, as I had already set up and animated escalators for one of my first videos, in which I explored the original Coconut Mall and its hidden details. The way this escalator animation works is you have two pieces, the main set of stairs and then a single step. For the down escalator, you have the set of stairs animate downward until they've moved enough to let the top step pop out all the way. Then you reset their position in a single frame, so that the animation loops seamlessly and the stairs seem to continuously disappear into the floor. And the up escalator is the same thing, but backwards. Now that those are in place, I can set up a nice render of the main room for Twitter. If you want to see updates on my project, that's where I'll be posting them. And yeah, It's called Twitter. I have a 2-letter minimum requirement for company names. You can't go taking letters. There's only 26. We made words so that you don't run out of letters. I guarantee they're gonna go for punctuation next. Anyways, where was I? Oh right, I kept doing small texture updates in the main room. I also created a clay texture for the flower pots by putting a brown color overlay on a concrete texture. At this point, I feel like I've got a lot of momentum going, so I'll finally move on to something that I've been really looking forward to. Probably my favorite part of the original Coconut Mall is the shortcut through this store called Delfino Dream. It's the reason that all of the other stores feel so real, because you actually get to race through this one. I would make some remark about how bad this stuff looks, but I just love that I get to update it all. But I guess we should start with the outside of the store first. This weird zigzag thing ain't gonna cut it, so I threw the plank material on there and started making a Delfino Dream sign. I'm not a huge fan of the aesthetic they've given this place. It's got more of an outdoors hiking look, as opposed to the raw premium look of the original, so I typed out Delfino Dream in whatever boring Arial font Blender defaults to. Then I converted the text to mesh and extruded it with the E key to make it 3D. Now I can use the Boolean modifier to cut this shape out of the sign. Next I put a red wood material on the doorway and some other areas that it feels like it fits. I also made this merch display look a little more interesting by using the skybox material to give it a glowing sunny sky background. I spent a little while putting the red wood on the trim and counters and the handrail wood on some surfaces as well. I also used area lights in these slots in the ceiling to get some basic lighting going in here. Now that we've got some of the furnishings textured, I want to figure out how I'm going to do the walls. I started by testing basic colors to get an idea of what I want to go for. I ended up leaning into the wood aesthetic and used the planks on the walls. This is sort of a risky material to use here. I am riding the fine line between cozy and condemned, but I think by the end it'll work out. I also got rid of this weird abstract art and put up a smaller version of the Delfino Dream sign. This is starting to look like something you might expect out of Mario Kart 8 and not a mobile game, but that just makes these t-shirts look extra unacceptable. Now I could just use elements of the track's sign texture and make these look passable. That would be the smart thing to do, since I wouldn't need to make any new textures and it would be relatively quick. But screw that, I want to make some t-shirts. I started off by looking at some textures from other tracks. I ended up making a couple Animal Crossing designs, which is another reason I wanted to make my own t-shirt textures. I also used the Mario Motors and Wario Billionaires team logos. I kept taking parts of textures and making t-shirts out of them, focusing on variety of color. This right here is why I was so excited to do this whole project. I think what gives a track its character is the thought that goes into tiny decisions like these. Also, this sure beats unwrapping triangle cylinder cubes. After putting the shirt textures on the t-shirts, I'd say they look pretty good. I also used the t-shirt textures for these shopping bags. Well, now there's some merchandise in here, but I think we still need more. So I went ahead and downloaded some Splatoon 2 drip and set it up. I love that this project let me take things from other Nintendo games and bring them into Coconut Mall without looking out of place. And after setting up a few lights and messing with a few textures, I'm ready to grab some renders and post them. It's a little sad being done updating this shop, since this is what I was looking forward to the most, but there was no need to worry, for most of the fun detail work was still ahead. But first, I decided to do some more of the basic stuff. I actually went ahead and foraged for some textures in other Mario Kart tracks. That way I have more options ready to experiment with. I ended up finding a way better wall texture in Mario's Circuit, one that tiles so much better, meaning you don't notice the seams where the image repeats. I also found that better specular map I was talking about earlier, the one that replaced my crappy floor tile map. I went around and put this on all sorts of shiny surfaces, like the escalator handrails and the glass and whatnot. And after updating some flower beds and baskets in the main room, I figured I should move on to doing the general texture work in the plaza room. So I duplicated the retextured fountain over and started experimenting with floor options. I ended up deciding that I definitely had to use the original floor pattern. Otherwise, I'd need to be in timeout right next to whoever changed those original floor tiles. But after some looking, I couldn't find anything, so I decided to try and upscale the old texture myself. Creating this texture from scratch isn't really feasible for me, so instead I'm just going to try and work with what I've got. I started by doubling the size of the image. Then I used a neural filter in Photoshop that gets rid of JPEG compression, which cleared this texture up quite a bit. And finally, I messed with the brightness and contrast a bit and generated a normal map. And there we go, that's not too bad. I pressed on updating walls and pillars and eventually started working on the ramp. I decided not to bring back the original cheese grater texture they used here, and to instead go for something a little nicer. I used this awesome stone brick texture for the walls, and the plank texture for the road. After this came a bunch more simple texture stuff. Benches, poles, signs, flowers, etc. I even grabbed some new foliage from Super Bell Subway to put around the palm trees. I also put some ivy on the ramp, which really makes it look great. I also ran back into Super Bell Subway to steal a couple of the vending machines. They look way better than the BCP vending machines. So that's most of the basic updating for the plaza. I could move on to the food court section, but that's going to be a pretty big undertaking, and I'd rather start with something smaller. So I headed to this store on the bottom floor of Section 1. This is one of the few stores in this mall that's not just an empty window, but an actual modeled store. There was a lot of putting textures on cans and cups and things. I also fixed these lights, which were for some reason set up like an inch from the counter. After doing some texture work, I moved on to the shop right next to this one, which really just needed the flowers and textures updated. And while we're over here, I might as well update this Fire Flower store too. I ended up using this normal map from Mount Wario that would usually go on one of these advertisement banners, but it works perfectly on whatever these things are called. I want to do more to make these stores look better, but this'll do for now. Next, I figured I might as well start fixing this toy store. This toy store is awful. First of all, it's completely empty. So I got some textures from Ribbon Road and put them on some cubes. Now the store actually has stocked shelves, including the Ribbon Road track itself. But another huge problem with this store is the fact that they have an actual toy store brand in Mario Kart, but instead they insist on calling this store, get this, toys. So I deleted that crap and put up a Toad Toy Store sign. Originally, I was just gonna have this be a flat plane, but I decided to have it sort of mounted onto a wood block, which I think looks cool. Then I decided to pursue the Toad Toy Store branding further by using these cool red and green mushroom textures, split red on the left and green on the right. Now for the interior. I started with the floor, looking for something that resembled carpet. I ended up trying a white overlay on the grass texture, and that worked way better than it should have. Then I decided to do some remodeling. I split the back wall and extruded the right side, to give the store some more depth and an interesting shape. I also scaled this back wall down to create a forced perspective, making this room look larger than it really is. Then I went around putting shelves in place and putting boxes on those shelves. I also put up a sign and a poster, as well as the checkout counter. Now this is a little closer to a toy store. Slight backroom vibes, but I think it's still an upgrade. Just don't go in here at night if you want things to stay Euclidean. After this, I went back over to Super Bell Subway and borrowed a few expensive kitchen appliances that I'm sure they didn't really need. These will go perfectly behind the counter here, and are exactly what I need for the food court. Plus, dang, the microwave looks crazy with the normal map on. After that, I went ahead and updated the cash register, which I think looks a lot better now. Yes, that's the microwave texture. Then I replaced most of the other cash registers around the mall. This is a good time to explain how you could make this kind of stuff a little easier. If you want to move things around the model without it being infuriating, all I have to do is use Shift-S to set the 3D cursor to the destination register's origin. Then use Shift-S on the register I want to move, and move selection to 3D cursor. Just make sure you have your origin set to their geometry, and this is a very handy way of moving things. After all of this register business, I went back to the toy store and enhanced it a little further. I added a band of mushroom texture across the walls, which I think makes the store a little less creepy. Then I did some more updating to the flower shop downstairs. I put a checkout in there and added more flower displays inside. And I put up a different version of the store sign above the checkout. Now that I've enhanced everywhere else so much, I should go back and do a little more to the curry place. I changed some textures a bit and made a little hallway going back to the theoretical dining area. After a few details, I think this is a slightly more convincing restaurant, but there's actually a couple of stores that I haven't even touched yet. The first of which is called Coco, and the other is called, or at least that's what I have to assume based on the sign. This Coco store looks like a clothes store, so it should be pretty simple considering I've already done Delfino Dream. First, I've got to give it a checkout counter and stop these mysterious rocks from poking through the wall. I also updated a few textures and brought some of the new t-shirts in here. I went to assign the steel material to the door frame and realized that this material should probably have a texture, not just a solid color. So I cracked into Photoshop and started on a steel texture. I just want some vertical lines, so I'll use the fibers effect. And then I can plug it in and see how it looks. Well, that's not quite right. See that super obvious seam where the lines don't connect? That's because I just made a picture and didn't actually make sure that it tiles. So how do we fix this? Well, it's a simple idea with a very complicated execution. Basically, I want this image to have a top that blends into the bottom. The sides should do the same, but they already tile well enough, so we'll just focus on the vertical tiling. To start, I put two of the image stacked vertically. Then I joined them, then I selected that horrible seam with the rectangle selection tool. I right-clicked and used generative fill to let Photoshop's AI figure out how this should actually look. and luckily it did a decent job. But I'm not done yet. So I selected the original image resolution of 256 by 256 to just get the top half of this AI layer that I generated, which is actually the very bottom of the texture. After separating it, I selected what was left of the AI layer and brought it to the top of the texture. Now, the top and bottom will tile, but I still need to use the AI again to blend this new top onto the top of the original texture. Now that that's all done, I can get back to updating the clothes store. I went ahead and started making a new sign, because I really don't get why they just called this place Coco when they could have named it Coco Mode, a clothes store from the original Coconut Mall. Now that we fixed that incomplete callback, we can move on to remastering. I think this is supposed to be a library, but we've already got Kamek's bookstore over here that we've got to make, so let's turn this into a cafe. How about the Coconut Cafe? I started off by remastering the original Coconut Cafe sign manually in Photoshop, which ended up looking alright. Then I expanded the room a bit and adjusted the furniture. After updating some textures, I started making some seating. I made a table and a chair and duplicated them around. Oh, and remember that cool sign I made? Well, it turns out there's a way better looking Coconut Cafe sign already on the sign texture. So that was a fun waste of time. Now that this shop is all done, I can set up the camera and grab a render of it. This time, I'm not just making a tweet though. I'm actually going to need this render for something. See, the original Mario Kart Wii version of Coconut Mall actually does something really clever with these shop windows, because modeling an actual 3D shop in each of these windows would be too much for the system to handle. They instead use images that are projected onto flat planes that have been indented in the middle. And I'm going to do the same thing here, or at least I'm going to try. I'm not sure how well this technique will have aged, but it would be really cool to use the same method to make this version of Coconut Mall feel less abandoned than the BCP version. After cropping the render in, I exported it and put it on a plane. I also accidentally had the cash register floating, but I didn't fix it because I didn't want to, and it's kind of funny. But once I put the plane in place, shaped it, and made it emissive, this actually looks pretty good. After using this method on another store, I'm thinking this is going to work just fine. So I've got the main Section 1 stores updated, and I have a few renders and some empty windows, but there are a few of these upstairs stores that I'd like to make my own models for, like Kamek's bookstore. I started by making a cube and deleting the front face. Then I did a loop cut with Ctrl K, inset faces with I, and used S to scale those faces in. I went for a dark, cool look with the materials, and I copied the bookcase over from the cafe as well as the checkout counter. And after setting up a few bluish lights, I started preparing a new texture. This is going to be one huge texture that contains any store details that I make, starting with the books. I could probably get away with just keeping the color palette on these books, but what fun would that be? The whole point of this project was to have fun with these kinds of details, and boy did I. Most of these books were simple squares with text and PNGs. For the Splatoon book, I went to Nintendo's Splatoon 3 website and nabbed a bunch of their cool PNGs. And yeah, I know this says Squidling instead of Inkling. I fixed that later, because apparently that's more of an issue than a floating cash register. After finishing the rest of these book textures, I applied them to the geometry. I didn't really consider the front faces of these books, but I figured it out. I also put the texture on the Coconut Cafe books, and I even updated this little picture frame using the sign texture. I'd say this Kamek's bookstore is looking pretty neat. Let's do this place next. I got rid of its weird geometry sign and replaced it with this Dino Dino outdoor camping goods sign. I used the same room geometry and started swapping textures. I want to make a tent to sit on display in here, which should be pretty simple. I started with a cube and scaled the top down to a point. Then I went back to Photoshop to work on the texture. I made a green triangle for the front face and another triangle for all the other faces. I actually used a step from the escalator texture as the zipper. Then I started making the rods out of a cylinder. At first the cylinder had too many faces, so I lowered it in the initial creation settings down here on the left. I also made sure to delete faces that are hidden anyways. Then I made a normal map for the store details, and I even used that cloth normal map and comped it onto the tent face, which looks really good. And to finish the tent, I added a loop cut and indented it on the sides a little bit to give it that tent shape. Now I would have put some kind of little sign next to it that would theoretically have the price and info and everything. So I took this sign from the Animal Crossing texture and generated a normal map for it. Then I used some basic geometry and reused a few textures to create the sign pole. After the sign was completed, I realized that I've got these things in the wrong spot. They should be on this side if I want them to be visible to the racers. Then I set up some shelves, shoes, and hats. I realized that the shoes are each 2,000 vertices, so I used the decimate modifier to bring the polygon count way down. I also deleted back faces that aren't visible from the outside of the store. Now to do something with this weird glowing jail thing. I deleted the bars and made a plane with this garage door pattern on it. I'll have this shop be closed down, and what better to be closed for the summer than a winter clothing store? Well, that's pretty much all for the Section 1 stores I want to update. But right at the turn into the main room, we've still got this little cafe to work on. I moved the lights up off the counter and swapped the register out. Then I messed around with the cafe cafe sign, but decided to just use a flat fountain cafe sign. Then I set up a few textures and brought in the good old steel counter from Super Bell Subway. Now this is more like it, but we're still not done yet. We've got to figure out something for the place next door. It seems to be some kind of cosmetic store or something, but by this point I was pretty burned out from all the store updating, and I really had no clue how I was going to make something out of this shop. But after a break, I got myself to make this store work at any cost. So I opened the sign texture, looked for something close enough, and said, screw it, anti-freeze. That's probably what's in these bottles anyways. After some texture stuff, this looks good enough. At this point, I felt like I was ready to work on the food court. I started out with some easy texture stuff and set up a few lights. I started putting some logos on these plastic cups. I also put this Moo Moo Meadows branding on the milk cartons, and some other random brands on some other random containers. Then I set up the steel counter in the back so that they actually have somewhere to prepare food in here. I'd say this food court's looking a lot better. Let's set up this ramp in the exit section. This was the same exact process as the plaza ramp, and yielded equally great results. I've noticed that the best way to unwrap slightly complex objects is to select basic components/shapes and unwrap them individually. And of course, I had to put the ivy up too. Now that I'm over here, I should update some of these textures in the exit section. The floor hasn't even been replaced, and that's the first thing I did to this model. After that, I did some work in the sunroom, starting with the palm tree and foliage. I also updated these benches and made sure to do so for all the other benches in the mall. Then I started setting up some nice lighting in the sunroom. That is, until the lights stopped working. Seems I've hit the 128 light limit, and I've done almost nothing to manage them. So I put all of the lights into several collections that are organized by location. That way I can keep most of them hidden and only activate the lights in the section that I'm rendering. Now that this room looks nice, I made sure that the entrance was up to date as well. I revamped the flower bed and fixed some of the walls. At this point, I was feeling like I had done most of what I needed to do on this project, but there was still plenty ahead, like the parking lot. I started with the palm trees, separating and updating one of them to duplicate over the old ones. And it looks like some of the old ones kinda got obliterated somehow. Whoops. I made sure not to just delete all of the old palm trees at once, cause then I might forget where some of them were. I also set up the distant low poly trees. After the palm trees, I put a normal map on the road and fixed how horrible I made it look. It's still not great. I'll fix that later. For now, I'd rather update these big brick blocks. I decided to bring back the original shell brick cubes, so I upscaled the texture in Photoshop and made a normal map for it. That's pretty nice, and these new cubes are 12 triangles instead of 458. That means I'm saving 1,784 polygons this way. I also updated the cool shell wall texture from the original Coconut Mall. It's something that I felt this was still missing. I feel like I've made some real progress, but I was past the point of being impressed. Earlier, I got to a stage in the project that I felt like this was turning out really great, but by this point, I had been working on it for weeks, and had sort of forgotten how the original BCP version looked. But if I go back and look at the BCP version for a moment, yeah, this is an improvement. For quite a while, I went around doing pretty uninteresting updates, fixing some things in Section 1, making a render for this window, setting up exterior textures, setting up some of the out-of-bounds but visible areas, fixing more random spots that I accidentally deleted at some point, and eventually I made my way to unwrapping the road. This process was pretty bad, as are the results. It's mostly the transitions from one section of track to the next. I think most of it looks a lot better. After that, I did a bunch more texturing out in the parking lot, putting concrete on the stairs, fixing bushes and flowers, and setting up the outside entrance. Then I went back inside, grabbed some renders of different stores, and set them up. I kept updating small things until I noticed that these gold rings looked really bad now. I did update the gold texture, but lots of textures look bad on this now. I ended up just putting something on it that looked decent, and hoped this issue would not show up again. After a little more random work, I ended up creating a new Blender project. I'm not really liking how this is turning out. I think I'll start over. Well, actually, this is a project for creating and rendering new storefronts to put in some of the windows. I just want to get the renders from here, so I'm allowed to use as many polygons and textures as I want. I started by taking some of the items from the mall that I know I'll need, by using Ctrl-C to copy them and Ctrl-V to paste them into the new project. But wait, these cups look so bad now. And again, it's not the texture, it's the geometry. Well, it's nothing I can't just ignore for a little longer. The first shop I set up was this Princess Orange store. I used the same wall normal map with green and orange colors. Then I rendered it and started working on the next shop. This was nice. It felt like I was back to working on the good stuff. No more unwrapping roads or managing a ridiculous amount of objects. Just designing and executing cool store designs based on signs. My favorite was the Super Marine World store. I ended up making a fish tank and putting a starfish PNG in there from an Animal Crossing texture I found. Then I made some basic sand out of a cube that I loop cut and reshaped a bit. And this sand texture is actually just the ceiling texture. After that, I made some coral and brought in some fishes from Super Mario Sunshine. I was gonna download the model, but instead I just threw the preview image into Photoshop and generated a normal map for it. The nice thing is, I can afford to do this since these textures aren't gonna end up being in the final track. Instead, everything's just gonna be compressed into a single render. Then I added a few snorkels on the wall from Splatoon 2, and I modeled a surfboard to hang on the wall. Another really cool store to make was the record shop. This was the perfect opportunity to hang up the album cover I made for a Mario Kart track details video. And I made a vinyl record out of a cylinder with the Splatoon 2 outdoor hat texture on it, which should not have worked. I also used some Splatoon 2 headphones and brought in a speaker from Mario Kart Stadium. Now I'm faced with a bit of a conundrum, because this render needs to go in two stores, Shy Guy Records and Roy Smooth Sounds. Luckily they have the same color scheme, but which sign do I put up? I ended up just putting up this sale sign, so that way this render works for both stores and we still have something going on behind the counter. Now that these renders are done, I can put them in their respective stores. This was really satisfying, having all of the cool renders done and placing them under their signs. Now the main room has a little more going on. So do the escalator handrails. They broke too. I can put up with the gold rings and plastic cups, but the escalator handrails? No, that's the final straw. I need to figure this out. I was able to determine that it obviously wasn't the material, because when applied to new geometry, it looks fine. I thought I might have literally decimated everything by accident when I used the decimate modifier at some point, but the only thing that seemed to have any effect was to change the shading between smooth and flat. They both looked terrible, but this must be connected to the issue. And as it turns out, I was right. Whenever I would update these textures, I would separate the geometry and rejoin them to the main model after I was done updating them. And through doing so, one way or another, their shading was auto-smoothed. Auto-smooth shading sets different faces to smooth or flat, depending on their angle and probably some other variables. This is supposed to make the object look better, but it seems my copy of Blender is a tad bit inebriated, because this looks a little less than better. Heck, it's far off from good, nay I say, it's right about terrible. Now this didn't make everything look bad, but it definitely didn't go over well with the escalator handrail. I tried for a while to revert this somehow, but there didn't seem to be a way of restoring geometry to its original shading. Well, there is one way. I re-imported the original BCP model into a new Blender project and began separating the escalator handrails. These have the right shading, and after pasting them into the new Coconut Mall, I can apply the texture again. This wasn't the best solution, but it worked, and it wasn't that bad for just these handrails. And then, to my horror, I discovered that there was a number of things that looked terrible and required replacement, including all of the pillars. You know, the cubic cylindrical triangle pillars that suck to select? Those ones. Those are the ones that I have to select all of them and move them over to a new project. Oh my. But I got it together and pushed onward, doing all the little finishing touches. I've said it before, but this is probably the most dangerous part of these projects, or any project really. It's that last 5 to 10% that regrows elsewhere once completed. An endless chase for perfection that is all too easy to be swept up in. Not to mention, the organizing side of this project, well, it didn't exist, so I really just had to pick some point that was good enough, lest I decide to redo major sections of the model. Anyways, I fixed a few more oddly shaded surfaces and brought the Pianta back to the Coconut Mall sign. This time he's in full 3D, although he doesn't have legs, tough luck. Alright, now I have to hurry and start making renders before I see something that needs fixing. Of course, I did see things that needed fixing. I added a fish tank under the stairs too. I spent a long time on that. But now I'm rendering for real. This is the stage where the bugs become features. That palm tree texture, it just looks that way, because these trees couldn't handle the rad energy of this building, or the organic antifreeze they water them with. That looks kinda weird and glitchy. Well, what do you mean? I set the roughness to 0, that's your reflection. The project ends when you're ready to say, this is my work. If you love it, you love it. If you hate it, then too bad, because I'm not fixing it. This project was an uncoordinated adventure towards a better Coconut Mall. I knew it couldn't be perfect, but just to make it better than something done by a team of actual professionals was pressure enough. And there were plenty of times when I had to ask myself, is this an improvement? Did I make something cohesive? Don't these colors kinda look like a public bathroom? But after finishing this project, I can say that the answer to these questions is yes. Now I kinda wanna redo the color scheme, but alas, the project is done. It's hard for me to be proud of this just because it's hard to comprehend. This model isn't like Toad's Factory or Luigi's Circuit, where I can go, yeah, this racetrack looks better than that old one, where I can say that the gear room is clearly improved. Because in Coconut Mall, it all kinda just blends together into one chaotic but awesome model. I think that the Toad's Toy Store looks better, and I think that the floor tile looks better, but it's hard to see it all as a better version of the same track that I originally started with. I think it's because it isn't really the same track. I've changed it so much visually that it feels like a new track, and I think that that in itself is kind of an accomplishment that I haven't achieved with any of my other previous revamps. But still watch those other ones because they're really long and they have a lot of advertisements in them. Anyways, I think it's time to show off some renders. I bring you Coconut Mall, renovated, restored, revitalized, and reopened. It may have turned out a little public bathroom-esque, but I think overall it's a pretty big improvement. And it better be, because that's what this is. But it was also a total blast, albeit an absolute nightmare. I decided to leave the whole modding thing to somebody else because, well, this already took a couple of months to do, and I think in another week my subscribers might fire me. Plus, I know I'll botch it with my non-existent modding skills anyways. And I figured there'll be some folks out there who would enjoy setting up a model like this. I think that these videos are a really cool opportunity for a sort of open collaboration with anyone who wants to do stuff with these models, which is a nice sounding way of saying, someone else will do it. I did set up things so that it'll be easy, or at least hopefully possible, to mod the track into the game. And I really do think that there are people who would appreciate a decent quality model to make a track out of. I know I certainly enjoy seeing the models I create turned into something playable. Anyways, I hope you got something out of this video. I think I'm done revamping tracks for a little bit. I think I'll probably do another one when the Andromeda collides with the Milky Way. If I start then it should be out sometime around the heat death of the universe. But before entropy drapes over our reality and consumes the final breaths of this universe, I'm gonna do some weekly DS game reviews or something. I've really missed manageable editing timelines and having an actual upload schedule. Well, I think that's gonna do it. I'll talk at you guys later. Thanks.